The farmer's market was alive with activity, a harmonious blend of old traditions and new visitors. Vibrant stalls stretched in neat rows, adorned with an array of fresh produce, jars of honey, baked goods, and colorful flowers. The air was rich with a mix of sweet and savory aromas, warm cinnamon from the baker's corner, earthy herbs from a nearby vendor, and the crisp scent of freshly picked apples. The townsfolk bustled about with an easy rhythm, their voices weaving a tapestry of cheerful exchanges. Old friends greeted one another, sharing hearty laughs and catching up on the week's events. Children darted between stalls, their giggles and excited shouts cutting through the hum of bartering and chatter. This was more than just a marketplace. It was the heartbeat of the community, a sanctuary where everyone felt safe. It represented unity, where time slowed down and life's worries felt like a distant memory. But under this cheerful facade lay an unseen crack, a brewing tension that only needed the wrong spark to erupt. The arrival of an unwelcome disturbance threatened to disrupt the harmony, turning this idyllic haven into the scene of an unexpected confrontation. At a modest wooden stall near the center of the market stood a man who towered above most others. Broad-shouldered and solidly built, his size often drew stares, though he carried himself with a quiet humility. His rugged clothes, worn from years of labor, were as unassuming as his demeanor. This was a retired Delta Force commander. Years ago, he had been a shadow in some of the world's most dangerous conflicts, leading covert missions that few would ever hear about. His hands, calloused from farming, had once dismantled threats with precision and skill. After decades of living on the razor's edge, James retired early, seeking refuge in a simpler life. He left behind a career steeped in secrecy, violence, and sacrifice, retreating to the countryside where the soil offered solace and the open skies brought a measure of peace. Yet, the ghosts of his past lingered, haunting his quiet moments. James wasn't looking for trouble. He had fought his battles and carried his scars, both visible and hidden. His only desire now was to live in harmony with the land, tending to his crops and letting the world pass him by. Trouble announced itself on the roaring engines of 4 motorcycles, their guttural growls disrupting the tranquil air. The riders dismounted, clad in leather jackets adorned with crude patches and insignias that spoke of rebellion and chaos. They were led by a wiry, sharp-featured man with a cruel grin and a chip on his shoulder. Razor exuded authority over his crew, a ragtag group of misfits who thrived on intimidation. Trouble announced itself on the deafening roar of 4 motorcycles, their engines snarling like wild beasts as they tore into the peaceful ambience of the market. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and an uneasy stillness spread like a ripple through the crowd. The once cheerful chatter of vendors and customers was replaced by the low, throaty growl of the bikes, their guttural hum a stark intrusion into the otherwise serene day. The riders dismounted in unison, their boots crunching against the gravel, each movement deliberate and brimming with an unspoken menace. They were a study in chaos, clad in leather jackets scrawled with crude patches and emblems that seemed to glorify rebellion and disorder. The jagged, spray-painted insignias hinted at lives lived on the fringes of law and order, each patch telling a story of defiance, domination, and destruction. Leading the pack was Razor, a wiry man with sharp, angular features that seemed almost carved from stone. His face was a canvas of hardened edges, from the perpetual sneer curling his lips to the faint scar tracing his left cheekbone. Razor didn't need to speak to command attention. His presence alone was enough. A cruel grin tugged at the corners of his mouth as he surveyed the market, his sharp eyes darting over the stalls like a predator sizing up its prey. A chip on his shoulder was more than a metaphor for Razor, it was his identity. His movements were a study in calculated arrogance, each step purposeful as though daring anyone to challenge him. The leather of his jacket gleamed in the sunlight, adorned with pins and studs that seemed to mimic the sharpness of his personality. Across his back, the emblem of his crew, a skeletal serpent coiled around a flaming wheel, stood out like a warning. The rest of his gang followed in his shadow, each one embodying a unique form of misfit rebellion. There was Brick, a hulking figure with arms as thick as tree trunks and a permanent scowl etched into his face. He moved with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who knew his size alone was intimidating. Next to him was Spider, lean and jittery, with tattoos crawling up his neck like living vines. His darting eyes gave the impression of a man constantly on edge, ready to pounce or flee at a moment's notice. Finally, there was Bones, the smallest of the group but perhaps the most dangerous, his wiry frame taut with pent-up energy and a grin that suggested he enjoyed chaos for chaos's sake. The gang spread out, their presence infecting the once joyful market with an air of unease. Razor sauntered to the center of the square, his boots leaving faint imprints in the dusty ground, as if marking territory. Vendors shrank back instinctively, their instincts screaming at them to avoid drawing attention. Mothers clutched their children a little tighter, and the usual vibrant energy of the market dulled to a tense hum. Razor's sharp gaze finally settled on one particular stall, tucked toward the edge of the market. There stood James Hall, a mountain of a man with broad shoulders and a calm, steady presence that contrasted starkly with the biker's chaos. James was stacking crates of apples, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as though the biker's arrival was just another minor inconvenience in his day. For Razor, the sight of James was like waving a red flag before a bull. There was something about the farmer's quiet indifference that rubbed him the wrong way. Razor's grin widened, and he motioned for his crew to follow as he strode toward James's stall. "Well, well," Razor drawled, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "What do we have here?" "A gentle giant in his natural habitat." The rest of the gang chuckled, their laughter echoing like the crackle of dry leaves. Razor leaned against the edge of James's stall, plucking an apple from the crate and inspecting it as though it were beneath him. "Nice produce you've got here," he continued, his tone dripping with insincerity. "Bet it takes a real man to grow this kind of stuff, huh?" James didn't look up, his hands methodically continuing their work. His calm, deliberate movements seemed to irk Razor even more, the lack of reaction fueling his desire to provoke. Spider snickered, his voice high and grating. "Bet this guy's never even been in a fight. Looks like he's built for picking carrots, not throwing punches." Brick joined in, his deep voice booming. "Yeah, probably too slow to catch a chicken, let alone throw a decent swing." Bones chuckled darkly, his grin widening. "Maybe we should give him some pointers, huh?" By now, the market had all but come to a standstill. The usual symphony of voices and haggling was replaced by a charged silence, the kind that precedes a storm. Marketgoers watched with a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, their eyes darting between the bikers and James. James finally looked up, his gaze meeting Razor's with a calm intensity that stopped the biker mid-laugh. It wasn't an angry glare or a fearful glance, it was something else entirely. There was a weight to James's eyes, a quiet strength that seemed to see straight through Razor, peeling back the layers of bravado to the insecure man underneath. "Are you done?" James asked, his voice low and steady, carrying just enough authority to make Razor's grin falter for a split second. The question hung in the air, simple yet loaded with unspoken meaning. It was as though James wasn't just asking about the apple in Razor's hand, but about his entire presence in the market, his antics, his intimidation, his need to prove himself. For a brief moment, the tension reached its peak, the entire market holding its collective breath as they waited to see what would happen next. Razor and his gang were known for their petty crimes, extortion, vandalism, and the occasional bar brawl. Their presence in the market was tolerated more out of fear than acceptance. Razor, embittered by a life of rejection and failure, took pleasure in asserting dominance wherever he could. The bikers sought amusement in provoking others, especially those who appeared vulnerable. They viewed the farmer, with his quiet presence and large frame, as an easy target, a man they could belittle for sport. The hum of the market faltered as the bikers approached, their raucous laughter and the rumble of their bikes cutting through the lively atmosphere. Vendors glanced nervously at one another, their smiles fading into thinly veiled apprehension. James stood by his stall, meticulously arranging jars of honey and baskets of fresh vegetables. He noticed the bikers' arrival but remained focused on his task, his expression calm and unbothered. Razor's sharp eyes landed on the farmer, and a mocking grin spread across his face. Nudging one of his companions, he pointed toward James. "Look at this guy," Razor sneered. "Built like an ox, but probably just as dumb. Bet he's never lifted anything heavier than a carrot." The gang burst into laughter, their voices grating against the market's usual harmony. James didn't react, his hands steady as he adjusted a display. "Hey, big guy," Razor called out, his tone dripping with condescension. "What's it like being the strongest scarecrow in the field?" The taunts grew louder, their words laced with ridicule and derision. Other marketgoers looked on uneasily, unsure whether to intervene or simply avoid drawing attention to themselves. For James, it wasn't the words that stung, it was the familiarity of the moment. Memories of similar taunts from his youth, long before he became a soldier, flickered in his mind. But those days were long gone, and he had no intention of letting these men pull him into their game. Still, as Razor and his gang edged closer, their laughter growing harsher, the tension in the air became palpable. The stage was set for a confrontation, and though James remained outwardly calm, the flicker of something more dangerous began to stir beneath the surface. Would the bikers push James too far? Or would the farmer's patience hold against their relentless mockery? The bikers linger near the farmer's stall, their smirks widening as they realize their taunts are drawing attention from other marketgoers. Razor, ever the instigator, leans casually against the edge of James's display, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of arrogance and curiosity. "Hey, big guy," Razor begins, his voice loud enough to catch the ear of a passing crowd. "You've got the hands of a farmer, but where's the fight in you? Can't you even stand up for yourself?" James doesn't flinch. He calmly adjusts a basket of tomatoes, his weathered hands steady and deliberate. His silence is like a wall, and it irritates Razor, who craves a reaction. "You hiding behind those vegetables?" Razor sneers, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet you've never seen real action in your life. Too busy playing with dirt." The gang erupts into laughter, emboldened by Razor's words. One of the younger bikers, eager to impress, steps closer and points at James's broad shoulders. "Yeah, big guy. You all muscle and no fight." James straightens slightly, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over the biker who spoke. Without saying a word, his presence alone quiets the younger man's laughter. Razor notices this and steps in to maintain control. "Look at him," Razor barks, smirking. "Too scared to even talk. What happens, huh? What happens when you push someone too far, and they've already seen the worst the world has to offer?" The rhetorical question lingers in the air, and for the first time, James's eyes meet Razor's. There's no fear in them, only a depth that Razor doesn't understand but instinctively dislikes. "You've got a lot to say," James finally replies, his voice low and steady. But words don't carry much weight. The bikers exchange looks, caught off guard by James's calm yet unnerving response. Razor, unwilling to back down, challenges James to a physical confrontation. "Why don't we settle this like men? Or are you too soft to handle it?" James doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he looks past the bikers, his gaze scanning the market where families and children are watching. His restraint speaks volumes, but the tension in the air is palpable. The bikers grow bolder, their voices louder, their jeers sharper. Razor paces in front of the stall, gesturing exaggeratedly to the small audience gathering nearby. Some onlookers are amused, enjoying the unexpected drama, while others shift nervously, unsure of how far things might go. James stands firm, his composure unshaken. But behind his steady demeanor, memories from his past begin to surface. The weight of his gear as he trudged through hostile territory, the sharp crack of gunfire and the adrenaline surge that followed. These images flicker in his mind, juxtaposed against the tranquil life he now leads. His hands tighten momentarily on the edge of the stall, a silent acknowledgement of the storm brewing within him. The bikers' taunts escalate further. One grabs a tomato from the stall and tosses it between his hands mockingly. Another starts mimicking James's movements, pretending to be slow and clumsy. Then, Razor makes his move. With a sneer, he reaches out to shove one of the baskets off the table. But before he can make contact, James's hand shoots out like lightning, gripping Razor's wrist. The suddenness of the action stuns everyone. James doesn't squeeze hard, just enough to stop Razor in his tracks. His voice, calm but commanding, cuts through the tension. "That's enough." For a moment, time seems to freeze. The market falls silent, all eyes on the two men. Razor, though startled, quickly masks his discomfort with a defiant laugh. "Oh, so you do have a spine," he sneers, pulling his arm free. "But let's see how far it'll take you." Just as Razor steps back, preparing for another move, James's expression changes. The calm exterior shifts to something colder, sharper, a glimpse of the soldier he once was. The audience is left wondering if James will finally fight back, or if he'll find another way to end the confrontation. Razor's bravado masks a deeper insecurity. Beneath the leather jacket and tough persona is a man desperate to prove his worth. He's the product of a life filled with rejection, and his need to dominate others stems from a fear of being seen as weak. As the tension escalates, Razor becomes more erratic, pushing his gang to continue their harassment. His desperation to maintain control blinds him to the subtle warning signs in James's demeanor. Among the crowd is a regular vendor at the market who sells homemade jams and crafts. Sarah has always admired James's calm and kind nature, but today she sees something different in him. Watching the confrontation unfold, Sarah begins to connect the dots. James's disciplined movements, his unnerving composure, the quiet strength in his eyes. She recalls hearing whispers from other locals about his mysterious past. As the bikers press on, Sarah wrestles with whether she should intervene or let James handle the situation. She knows the bikers are dangerous, but something about James's presence reassures her that he's far from defenseless. Razor, the leader, steps closer, his bravado intact but his movements more erratic. His gang surrounds James's stall, closing in like a pack of wolves. The other bikers, emboldened by their leader, begin knocking over produce baskets and laughing as the once bustling market turns eerily silent. Razor glares at James, his voice sharp and cutting. "Come on, big guy. Show us what you've got. Or are you just going to stand there and let us take what we want?" James exhales deeply, his calm composure now laced with an edge of intensity. He speaks slowly, his voice carrying an authority that seems to command the very air around him. "You don't want to do this. Walk away while you still can." Razor smirks, mistaking James's warning for weakness. "Oh, we'll walk away. But only after we've taken what's ours. And maybe taught you a lesson." It happens in a flash. Razor lunges forward, aiming to shove James, but before his hands can connect, James moves. His movements are fluid, almost instinctual, as he grabs Razor's arm, twists it expertly, and uses the momentum to bring him to his knees. The crack of Razor's wrist against the wooden stall echoes in the stunned silence. Gasps ripple through the crowd. James releases Razor, who stumbles back, clutching his arm in disbelief. The other bikers freeze, their bravado evaporating as they realize they're not dealing with an ordinary farmer. How many times have you underestimated someone, only to realize they're far stronger than you ever imagined? The bikers exchange nervous glances, their confidence shaken but not entirely gone. One of them, younger and more reckless, steps forward with a clenched fist. "You got lucky, old man. Let's see how tough you really are." Before the young biker can swing, James sidesteps effortlessly, disarms him with a precise maneuver, and immobilizes him with a hold that leaves no room for struggle. His actions are swift, efficient, and eerily controlled. The crowd watches in stunned awe, many of them seeing James in a completely new light. The peaceful farmer they thought they knew is now a man radiating strength and precision. James releases the young biker and steps back, his stance calm but ready. "This is your last warning," he says, his tone firm but not aggressive. "Take your friends and leave. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I won't let you push me, or anyone else around." Razor, still nursing his injured wrist, snarls. His anger outweighs his fear as he pulls out a small blade, hoping to regain the upper hand. The crowd gasps again. James's eyes narrow, and his voice drops to a deadly calm. "Put it down. You don't want to find out what happens if you don't." The tension in the air is electric. Razor hesitates, his confidence wavering as he stares into James's unflinching gaze. For a brief moment, the hardened biker feels something he hasn't felt in years: fear. When Razor lunges with the blade, James moves faster than anyone can process. In a blur of motion, he disarms Razor, twists his arm, and forces him to the ground. The blade clatters harmlessly to the side. The market-goers erupt in murmurs, the air thick with disbelief and admiration. With Razor subdued, the remaining bikers stand frozen, unsure of what to do. James straightens, his presence commanding as he addresses them directly. "Take him and leave. You've already made a fool of yourselves. Don't make it worse." The bikers scramble to help Razor up, their arrogance thoroughly deflated. Razor, now visibly shaken and nursing both his pride and his injuries, spits out a few choice words before limping away with his gang. As the bikers retreat, the market is silent for a moment. Then, whispers begin to ripple through the crowd. "Did you see that? Who knew he was so strong? Where did he learn to move like that?" James picks up the fallen produce baskets and begins to reset his stall as if nothing had happened. His calm, almost indifferent demeanor only adds to the mystique surrounding him. With Razor subdued, sprawled on the ground in a mix of dust and humiliation, the remaining bikers stand frozen, their bravado stripped away. Their wide-eyed stares dart between Razor and the towering figure of James, who now seems larger than life. James straightens, brushing dirt off his hands with a calmness that feels more intimidating than any loud outburst could. His voice cuts through the tense silence, low and steady but filled with authority. "Take him and leave. You've already made a fool of yourselves. Don't make it worse." The bikers glance at each other, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. One of them, clearly hesitant, takes a step toward Razor, who is still groaning on the ground, clutching his side. Razor waves him off weakly, his pride hurt as much as his body. "I'm fine," Razor snaps, though his voice trembles. His attempt to rise is shaky at best, and he winces with every movement. James watches them impassively, his gaze steady but unyielding. The weight of his presence hangs in the air, commanding respect without the need for further action. One by one, the bikers move to help Razor, their arrogance thoroughly deflated. Razor, leaning heavily on one of his comrades, spits out a few choice words, but they lack the venom they held earlier. His voice cracks as he mutters, "You'll regret this, old man." James tilts his head slightly, his expression unreadable. His next words are calm yet cut like steel. "I already told you. Walk away. This is your last chance." The tone leaves no room for argument. Razor glares at him but says nothing more. He limps away with his gang, their swagger replaced by a defeated shuffle as they retreat toward their motorcycles. As the roar of the bikes fades into the distance, an eerie stillness settles over the market. The once bustling square is now silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, like a ripple on a still pond, whispers begin to spread. "Did you see that? I didn't even see him move. Where did he learn to fight like that?" Marketgoers exchange odd glances, their gazes repeatedly drifting back to James, who now stands calmly by his stall. His movements are methodical as he picks up fallen produce baskets and resets them, his demeanor unchanged. It's as if nothing out of the ordinary just happened. A young woman, clutching her shopping bag, whispers to her friend, "He didn't even break a sweat." "Who is he?" An older vendor, someone who's known James for years, leans against his stall with a thoughtful expression. "I always knew there was more to him," he murmurs. "But that was something else." James doesn't acknowledge the murmurs or the stares. He focuses on his work, arranging the bruised apples back into their baskets and brushing off dirt from the fallen carrots. His hands move with practiced precision, but his mind is elsewhere, replaying the scene that just unfolded. For a brief moment, he feels the familiar rush of adrenaline, a sensation he thought he'd left behind long ago. It's a double-edged sword, a reminder of the man he used to be and the life he chose to leave behind. His eyes briefly scan the crowd. Some people look at him with fear, others with admiration. Most are simply curious, their gazes lingering as they try to piece together the puzzle of who James Hall really is. A small voice pulls him from his thoughts. "Mr. Hall." James looks down to see a boy no older than 10 standing a few feet away, clutching a bag of cherries. The boy's wide eyes shine with both awe and apprehension. "Are you a ninja?" The question catches James off guard, and a rare smile tugs at the corners of his mouth. "No," he replies gently, shaking his head. "Just a farmer." The boy looks unconvinced but nods, a grin spreading across his face. "You're really cool, though." Before James can respond, the boy's mother hurries over, apologizing profusely for the interruption. James waves her off with a kind smile, watching as she leads her son away. As James finishes resetting his stall, the tension in the market begins to ease. The hum of conversations gradually resumes, and customers tentatively return to their shopping. But the energy is different now, charged with a newfound respect for the quiet farmer who showed he's far more than he seems. One by one, people approach James, some to offer a word of thanks, others to ask if he's okay. James responds politely but briefly, deflecting attention as best he can. He doesn't seek praise or recognition. All he wants is to get back to the simplicity of his work. But even as he resumes selling his produce, James knows things won't be quite the same. The illusion of the ordinary farmer has been shattered, replaced by the image of a man with a mysterious past and a quiet but undeniable strength. As the sun begins to set and the market winds down, James takes a moment to pause and look around. The day's events have stirred something deep within him, memories of a life he thought he'd left behind, and questions about what it truly means to live peacefully. With a deep breath, he returns to his stall, ready to pack up and head home. But in the back of his mind, he knows this is just the beginning. While the bikers retreat for now, the tension isn't entirely resolved. Razor's glare as he leaves suggests this isn't the last time they'll cross paths. The audience is left wondering, will Razor seek revenge? And what other secrets does James hold? As the roar of the bikers' engines fades into the distance, the market gradually returns to life. The tension in the air dissipates, replaced by an almost electric buzz of excitement and awe. Vendors and shoppers cautiously approach James, offering a mix of gratitude and curiosity. Some shake his hand, others simply nod in silent respect, but all share the same thought: they'll never look at him the same way again. News of the incident spreads quickly. By the next day, stories about the fearless farmer ripple through the town, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. James becomes a local legend, someone who stood up to bullies and won, not with arrogance or violence, but with quiet strength and unparalleled skill. Yet, for James, life remains largely unchanged. He tends to his fields, sells his produce, and greets his neighbors at the market. But beneath the surface, he knows something is different. James catches himself smiling more often, a quiet pride taking root where there was once doubt. He isn't proud of the confrontation itself. Violence was never his first choice, but of the way he handled it, showing restraint and control while standing firm. In the solitude of his farmhouse, James reflects on the events. He sits on his porch, the golden light of sunset casting long shadows across his fields. A faint breeze rustles the leaves, and for the first time in a while, he feels at peace. Memories of his time in the Delta Force come rushing back, but this time, they don't haunt him. Instead, they feel like lessons, each mission, each challenge, a step that led him to this moment. He realizes that while his past shaped him, it doesn't define him. He's no longer the soldier who lived in the shadows, nor just the quiet farmer people underestimated. He's someone who has found balance, a man who can embrace peace without losing his strength. The respect he's earned from the community feels different from the fear he once commanded on the battlefield. This respect is built on understanding, on a shared sense of humanity. It's something he values deeply. As James reflects, the narrative subtly shifts to address the audience. The story becomes a mirror for the viewer to consider their own assumptions. How often do we judge others by their appearance or their quiet demeanor? How many times have we underestimated someone, only to realize their inner strength far exceeds our expectations? Viewers are encouraged to look beyond the surface in their daily lives, to question their own biases, and to treat others with kindness and respect. The next week at the market, James notices a change. People greet him warmly, their smiles carrying a newfound admiration. Even children, who once eyed him shyly from behind their parents, now approach him with curiosity. One vendor, an elderly woman who has been at the market for decades, speaks up. "You've reminded all of us that strength isn't about showing off, it's about knowing when to stand firm and when to let go." "Thank you, James." James nods, offering a humble smile. "Just doing what I had to do. Nothing more." As the day winds down, James catches a glimpse of a biker helmet resting on the handlebars of a motorcycle parked at the edge of the market. His body tenses for a moment, but then he notices the biker, a lone figure, purchasing apples from a stall. The biker glances at James and nods respectfully before riding off. James watches him go, a faint smile on his lips. It's a quiet reminder that change, however small, is always possible. The days following the confrontation settle into a calm rhythm. James, ever the practical man, doesn't dwell on the past. His mornings are spent in the fields, his afternoons at the market, and his evenings reflecting on the quiet life he's built for himself. Yet, something has undeniably shifted. The respect he's earned has spread beyond the market. Strangers passing through town ask about the farmer who took down the bikers, and his once solitary presence is now a source of inspiration. At the market, people who used to exchange only brief pleasantries now linger for longer conversations. They seek his advice, not just about farming, but about life, resilience, and how to stay grounded in the face of adversity. James answers humbly, his wisdom rooted in years of experience, both on the battlefield and in the fields he now tends. Meanwhile, one of the bikers, the youngest of the group, finds himself haunted by the encounter. His name is Kyle, a man barely out of his 20s, who had joined the gang searching for belonging and validation. Kyle can't shake the memory of James's calm gaze, the way he disarmed them not just physically but emotionally. For the first time in years, Kyle begins to question the path he's chosen. He starts making small changes, spending less time with the gang and more time thinking about what kind of man he wants to become. One day, he gathers the courage to visit the market alone. Standing awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, he eventually approaches James's stall. "Hey, I wanted to say I'm sorry," Kyle stammers, his voice barely audible. "For what happened? For what we did?" James studies him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a nod, he replies, "Apologies are a good start. The real change comes with what you do next." Kyle leaves with a bag of produce and something he hadn't expected. A sense of hope. Meanwhile, one of the bikers, the youngest of the group, finds himself unable to shake the events of that day. His name is Kyle, a man barely out of his 20s, with a lean frame and wide, searching eyes that still held traces of innocence. Kyle had joined the gang not out of malice or rebellion, but out of a desperate need to belong. Life had been unkind to him, marked by loneliness and a yearning for validation that the gang's camaraderie seemed to provide. But the encounter with James had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. Unlike the others, who laughed off their humiliation or buried it under bravado, Kyle couldn't ignore what he'd seen. The farmer's calm gaze haunted him, not with fear, but with a strange and unfamiliar weight. It wasn't just the physical prowess James had displayed, though that had been impressive. It was the quiet dignity, the unshakable strength of a man who had no need to prove himself. Kyle began to replay the moment over and over in his mind. The way James had stood his ground without malice or cruelty, the way he had spoken to them, not with threats, but with a calm authority that cut deeper than any insult. For the first time in years, Kyle found himself questioning the choices he'd made, the path he'd chosen, and the company he kept. Over the following days, Kyle began to withdraw from the gang. He stopped attending their late-night gatherings, where the others drowned their bruised egos in beer and exaggerated stories of their supposed exploits. Instead, Kyle found himself sitting alone, staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. Small changes crept into his routine. He started avoiding the trouble the gang sought out, opting instead to spend time walking through the quieter parts of town. He began to notice things he'd overlooked before, the way the sun lit up the trees in the morning, the laughter of children playing in the park, the smell of fresh bread wafting from a local bakery. The more he distanced himself from the gang, the more he realized how hollow his life with them had been. Their so-called camaraderie was built on fear and dominance, not trust or mutual respect. Kyle began to wonder if he had the courage to leave it all behind and start over. One morning, after a restless night of soul-searching, Kyle made a decision. He would go back to the market, not with his gang, but alone. He needed to face James, not as a member of the gang but as himself. Kyle arrived at the market just as the morning bustle was beginning. He stood at the edge of the crowd, feeling out of place in his worn leather jacket and scuffed boots. The cheerful chatter of vendors and customers seemed almost alien to him, a stark contrast to the harsh, rowdy world he was used to. For a long moment, Kyle hesitated, his nerves threatening to undo his resolve. But then he spotted James, standing at his stall, calmly arranging crates of produce with the same quiet focus that had left such an impression on him. Taking a deep breath, Kyle forced himself to move forward, his heart pounding with every step. When he finally reached the stall, Kyle stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure of how to begin. James looked up, his expression neutral as he recognized the young man. "Hey, I wanted to say I'm sorry," Kyle stammered, his voice barely audible over the market noise. He swallowed hard, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "For what happened? For what we did?" James studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes seeming to peer straight into Kyle's soul. There was no anger in his gaze, no judgment, just a quiet curiosity. After what felt like an eternity, James gave a small nod. "Apologies are a good start," he said, his voice steady and calm. "But the real change comes with what you do next." Kyle nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He hadn't known what to expect from this encounter: anger, dismissal, maybe even indifference. but James's words struck a chord deep within him. For the first time in years, Kyle felt something he hadn't known he was missing: hope. James reached for a small bag and began filling it with produce. When he handed it to Kyle, his expression softened just enough to reveal a trace of encouragement. "Here," James said. "On the house. Consider it a start." Kyle took the bag with trembling hands, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. As Kyle walked away from the stall, he felt lighter, as though he'd left behind a part of himself he no longer needed. He didn't know what his future held, but for the first time, he felt like he had the strength to face it. And perhaps, just perhaps, he could become the kind of man who, like James, didn't need to prove his worth to anyone. As the weeks pass, James receives an unexpected visitor, a man in a sharp suit, carrying an air of authority. He introduces himself as a former colleague from James's Delta Force days. "I heard about what happened at the market," the man says, leaning casually against the stall. "Word travels fast when someone like you makes a move." James tenses, his peaceful facade cracking slightly. "I left that life behind." The man smirks. "Maybe, but it hasn't left you. We could use someone like you. Just one mission, James. Nothing too complicated." James shakes his head firmly. "I've made my choice. I'm done." The man nods, but his expression suggests the conversation is far from over. As he walks away, he leaves behind a business card, its edges crisp and stark against the wood of the stall. James stares at it for a long moment before tucking it into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Life returns to normal, for now. James continues to work the land, sharing quiet moments with the community that has come to respect and admire him. But deep down, he knows the world he once left behind might call him back again. The epilogue ends with James walking through his fields at sunset, the soft glow of the horizon casting a long shadow. His steps are steady, but his mind is alive with possibilities. When the past comes knocking, will James be ready to answer? And what will it cost him this time?